So welcome to the second episode of Lash the Mohicans of Bourgeois Democracy. We are here today talking about China and the Five Eyes. And just as a preliminary note, this evening, the Canadian Parliament has gone along with Erin O'Toole's racist, saber-rattling, bloodlusty motion to call what China is doing in the Xiangyu region genocide. I personally disagree with that characterization, as does, as I have pointed out several times over the past few days, the majority opinion of the United Nations Human Rights Council. And people will look at that statement and they'll say, oh, well, you know, you got Iran and you got Venezuela in there, and we don't like them and we don't like what they have to say. And so we'll discount their opinion. Well, we shouldn't. We should really take into account that the majority of nations on the United Nations Human Rights Council doesn't find the allegations leveled by the United States and the Five Eyes nations against China to be credible. And what is happening in China? You know, you'll get the Western Maoist and the trot saying, oh, you think that China is, this wonderful workers' democracy, blah, blah, blah. No, the point is that China is laboring under enormously difficult conditions today, made worse by the fact that the United States wants to and has in Syria, in Libya, fostered Islamic extremism precisely for the purposes of destabilizing countries that it doesn't like.
Well, so I want to be really careful. Sorry to interrupt. I really want to be careful about the, using the phrase Islamic extremism, because it's not, the practice of Wahhabism is not necessarily, like, you can't necessarily intersect it with Islam. It's an interpretation of it, right? It's an interpretation to take what are fundamentalist elements and merge them with modernist elements. And with Salafism, it's a version of fundamentalism that rejects all modernity altogether. To stick strictly with the fundamentalist interpretation of the Quran. So, is the extremism like related to the religion? Yes. But there's also, like tens upon tens of millions of people that are practicing their religion the same as anybody else does. And it seems to get linked to Islam very easily in the tongues of especially Westerners, because we don't familiarize ourselves with the distinctions.
You're absolutely right. Big fat pasty white guy speaking here. I'll shut up if you guys have anything to qualify this. But the point is that I think that it's really important to note is that the U.S. plays upon these contradictions. The U.S. intentionally takes up any ID poll contradictions that it can and weaponizes them as a cudgel against global South states. Mm-hmm. So
all that.
I think that's important. You guys can chime in as you think. I'd like to hear about Andre's week this past week. If you just wanted to give us a rhapsody of your Twitter tribulations.
Nobody wants to know about the week that I've had. It started, it's funny because it started off as I saw that Ilhan Omar tweeted that, China has to be held accountable for the tortures, the rapes, the human rights abuses, the atrocities, this, that, and the third. And all I said was, "Oh, brother, here we go." That was it. That was the the long and short of what I said. Was just like, I can't believe Ilhan Omar too. And then the next thing I said was, watch me end up getting pulled into the blender, because I said, "Oh, brother," and I didn't follow it up with like rattling off a list of human rights atrocities that China is engaging in and how they're attempting to destroy cultures and oppress people from practicing their religion and destroying mosques and this, that, and the third. Because I wasn't ready to do all of that, I was just going to get pulled into the blender. And guess what happened? I was. So I said that I would like to be provided with information that would lead me to believe that a genocide is taking place, just as at any point that you charge genocide against a state, you then have a responsibility to do something about it. So if we have a responsibility to never let genocides and other such atrocities happen, then there's got to be some action that we in the West can take to either mitigate or prevent it from happening altogether. And what that usually looks like is, if not military invasion, which I don't think is going to happen, then we would have to do sanctions, we would have to do boycotts, we would have to, in whatever necessary cases, enact the Magnitsky Act. We would probably take a few courses towards cold warfare and lawfare altogether, right? When I ask somebody to provide me information that would lead me to believe that a genocide is taking place right now, with the weight of all of that responsibility behind charging genocide, immediately I get called a genocide denier. And I said, well, I want to get some information. Where's your information? And the information that's provided to me is information that I've already seen. And what I'm mostly seeing is accounts that were made by people who offered testimonials to the fact that there are detention facilities and re-education camps, that within the facilities, these camps, concentration camps as they describe them, that some horrific acts are taking place. And I say, okay, well, even if I'm to believe that that's true, then the issue with regards to the forced labor, with the religious repression, the bulldozing of mosques and everything else, can you provide me information on that? The information that's provided me, again, is information that I've already seen. Nothing is new like that I'm looking at. And I ended up getting so annoyed with people because I have the same access to the same information that they do. There's nothing special about me. I might write for Maclean's magazine, but I'm a freelance writer. I don't have special access to anything that nobody else does. I'm looking at the same information as everyone else. And with the information that I'm looking at, these stories fall apart under the slightest of scrutiny. So when I see labor camps or forced labor camps, and then I find out that these are companies that are hiring people that came out of a vocational program, and the entire intent of the program was to be able to give them meaningful work, then how am I supposed to see that as forced labor? When people voluntarily show up at work, they're paid a salary, they remit a significant portion of their salary back home to people who live in rural areas, and they go to visit them at whenever they want to. Just like here, if you decide that you want to go work for the oil patch in Alberta during the late 90s to the mid 2000s, you're probably going to move to Alberta. You're probably going to stay at a facility, either on site or, like a home or an apartment close by. You're going to remit money to your family. You're going to go visit your family every so often. There's nothing strange about that to me whatsoever. When I see things like they're bulldozing mosques, and the information that I'm told proves that mosques are being bulldozed and not replaced, mind you, is that there used to be a building with a dome on top of it, and now there's no longer a building with a dome on top of it. The dome has disappeared, so therefore it must be repurposed for some other use. And I say, okay, but the largest mosque in the neighborhood where I grew up doesn't have a dome on top of it. It is a repurposed building that used to be an office for the Sears distribution center right next door. And from the outside, it just looks like a 2-story office building. And from the inside, it looks like a mosque. So should I use Google Maps and send that to the Canadian government and ask us to sanction ourselves because the largest mosque in the neighborhood doesn't have a dome on top of it? And it's just like the more I get spammed with these stories and these testimonials and this proof that China is engaging in some grand human rights atrocity, and you look at it, and the more you look at it, the more it sort of fades out of existence. And now we're arguing about labor practices. We're arguing about surveillance. We're arguing about whether people are able to express themselves freely. Do they have true freedom of speech? And I say, okay, I'm willing to have a conversation about all of that. I'm willing to have a broad conversation about labor exploitation and the fact that people are providing more value for companies than they are paid themselves. I'm fully willing to have that conversation. I'm fully willing to have a conversation on digital rights freedom and the freedom from surveillance. I'm fully willing to have a conversation on freedom of speech. But that's not where we started in the first place. Where we started in the first place was a conversation on genocide. And if your backup for, if your proof that a genocide has taken place is the sort of Mott and Bailey thing where we're retreating from genocide and having conversations about right to privacy, right from labor exploitation, and so forth, and it tells me that you're not a serious person. Because if you did take this stuff seriously, we could discuss it on its own terms without having to sensationalize it with genocide. And the only reason that people are doing that, as far as I can tell, is because they know that we have the same practices here. We are being digitally surveilled. We do have our labor exploited. We do have people that are culturally repressed, that have been historically prevented prevented from practicing their own religions and cultures. That has not yet been reconciled. That we haven't come to terms with the horrendous things that we've done to Black people, to people of indigenous backgrounds, to indigenous nations, to people who practice Islam, etc. We haven't reconciled any of that, and we have no power, or at least we have not chosen to exercise our people power to force our governments to come to account for that. What we're going to do instead is give our government full and tacit support to essentially punish another country for the exact same shit that we're doing, and then feel self-righteous about it. And I'm just not with that.
Yeah, and here's the thing, is that on, zooming in on one of those areas, like the so-called forced labor, you look at Adrian Zen's second report. How does he define forced labor? It is literally any state-led investment and vocational training whatsoever. It does not matter to Adrian Zenz that labor is remunerated. It does not matter to Adrian Zenz that labor is voluntary. It does not matter to him. What it matters to him is merely that there is a state that has decided that there will be vocational training and state-led investment. And that's not coerced labor. That's not forced labor by any international standard. And yet we are treated ad nauseum to this accusation. So go ahead.
Before we go on, I like to point it out. The U.S. State Department just put out a memo saying what happened in Xinjiang is not a genocide.
Not genocide,
so,
yeah.
So
now, they did say that they said that human rights atrocities were taking place, but it did not rise to the level of genocide. So when I jokingly posted that, people were saying, okay, but did you not notice in the article that human rights atrocities are taking place? And it's like, I'm not agreeing with the U.S. State Department. I'm just saying that even the U.S. State Department can't sensationalize itself into charging genocide, because even they realize how preposterous a claim it is. At some point they've been playing chicken with this genocide accusation, and now they're swerving away from it because they realize they actually have the institutional responsibility to prove that this is happening, and along with that responsibility to prove is the responsibility to do something about it. And they're not willing to do that, but for some reason, the Canadian House of Commons believes that there is an institutional responsibility to do something about it. Michael Chung, a member of Parliament, just proposed that we boycott products or sanction China in the sense that any product that is making utilization of quote unquote forced labor, any company that is engaged in a relationship with these other companies, these subsidiaries or manufacturing facilities that are engaged in quote unquote forced labor, that we boycott their products. Which basically says, all right, so if a company employs Uyghur laborers, they're being targeted. Essentially, they're being racially profiled until they get rid of that labor force. So now we've just decided that we're going to collectively punish Uyghur people for being employed, for being gainfully employed. I don't understand what rational human being could look at the information in front of them and come to the conclusion that this is a sane policy. I don't see it.
I think there is a concerted campaign to decouple so-called from the Chinese economy, and Xinjiang is just one of the reasons they listed. I just recently saw another article coming out by Isaac Stonefish. He posted an article about how we should boycott Bitcoin because most of the Bitcoin mining is done in China.
In China,
and then he has evidence that much of the energy to power the Bitcoin come from Xinjiang. And in his article, he even said, even though we don't have evidence that Uyghur labor is being used in mining the coal in Xinjiang that's used to power the electricity for generating Bitcoin, but we should be aware there's ethical problems associated of having to do with any kind of business transaction that originated in Xinjiang. I mean, at this point, they're just trying to throw shit on the wall and see what sticks.
What sticks?
I mean,
yep.
Yeah. Yeah.
No, I want to, anyone who has any, comments on this, they're welcome to jump in. But this is the point, is that on each of these kind of silos of information, if you dig down into the nuts and bolts, the claims fall apart. the claims fall up. There's the massive kind of alpha one of, oh, it's a genocide, and then there's the subsidiary ones of, oh, it's forced labor in this region. And if you interrogate any of them, they fall apart. These claims fall apart. But because of this kind of hysteria in usually the Five Eyes nations of Canada, Australia, UK, US, they get whipped up into a frenzy. You're not allowed to challenge any of the basic premises or predicates.
I think that's the reason why a lot of people adopt the genocide label, because once you slap on the label of genocide, you can't question it. Anytime you question the validity of the claims, you are being called out for a genocide denier, just like Andre has been accused of on Twitter. It's so ridiculous. But if you actually look at the evidence presented by our Xinjiang expert Adrian Zenz, that's quoted by all the mainstream media. I actually read his report on the Xinjiang forced labor report. Right, in the mainstream media, it was presented as Chinese government is having Uyghur slaves to pick cottons in Xinjiang. Right, but if you actually read his report, what he said was, in China, in Xinjiang, the cotton picking is mostly done by local labor. In the district of Kashgar and Khotan, 80% of the cotton picking is performed by the locals. And then he pointed out some Chinese articles where they talk about the Chinese cadres, go in the fields, visiting those Uyghur labor. And he said, okay, this is the evidence of the state involvement. Right, and then he said, because we already know as an established fact that millions of Uyghurs are being put into concentration camp and put into re-education program. So understandably, if the Uyghurs are under the threat of being sent into the camp, if they don't perform cotton picking. I mean, there's like one innuendo implies the next, and then it's all built on his original basis, which was the claim of 1 million Uyghur in the concentration camp. I read that report too, and when I read the report, he admitted it was an extrapolation. He said it's not unreasonable to extrapolate. There's possibly 1 million Uyghur being in concentration camp in China. But that has been now...
1 million is like a low ball estimate. I was actually going through, because what I've been trying to do is piece together where some of these narratives are coming from, right? So I was doing database searches, I was doing news archive searches on where does this claim of, millions of Uyghur people being detained in concentration camps, where does it come from, and how has it progressed? And I'm shitting you not, in the course of about 6 months, I saw it start at hundreds of thousands, and then it was almost 1 million, and then it's 1 million, and now, and as of late last year, it was 3 million. Like, I've seen various people in the news claim that there's up to 3 million people in these concentration. Now, here's the thing: how many people are there in this province altogether? How many people of this particular background are there in this province? Basically, for there to be 3 million Uyghur people in concentration camps, that would be about 1/3 of the population in this particular region that are in concentration camps. If that was the case, how did this, A, how did it go undetected? And B, where are they all being kept? Do you know how much space you need to house 3 million people?
Yeah.
And that's the other thing. Yeah, if they're being rounded up en masse, then how, with the border being as porous as it is, why are they not pouring into Pakistan? Why are they not pouring into Kyrgyzstan? Why are they not pouring into Kazakhstan? Where is this flood of, when we saw people leaving Syria en masse because of the the amount of strife and violence that was taking place there, we immediately opened up our doors to refugees. So where is this flood of refugees that are traveling overland, that are trying to get to safe havens by boat, etc.? Where is all of this?
And the answer is where Saddam Hussein kept his WMDs.
it's gotten to a point where it's actually so absurd at this point that I'm almost like happy to be disliked for this entire thing, because I'm not a mark. Like I'm not a gullible fool. And in order for you to buy all of this, you would just have to be a gullible fool. So if that puts me on the opposite side of it, then fine. I'll be that evil denier or whatever. Sorry, go ahead, Carl.
So I was a masochist. So I actually went to dig out the original report where these claims originated. There are two main sources of 1 million Uyghurs in concentration camp. One of the sources is the China Human Rights Defender, which is an NGO.
They didn't claim the China Human Rights Defenders didn't even claim 1 million people. They didn't say up to 1 million. They said 660,000 is what they said.
And in the report, they did that based on supposedly their interview with 8 people.
Eight people. And it wasn't like 8 people that were administrators of a particular township or municipality. It wasn't people that would have any knowledge of how many people exactly would be missing. It was 8 random villagers. And they said, how many people do you estimate are missing from your village? And how big is your village? So the village is 3,000 or 3,000 plus. And there's 450 people missing from the village. Therefore, X% of people are missing from the village. It's just, they're asking a random person for an estimate. I don't know 450 people. In my local neighborhood, if 450 people I would say there's a lot of people missing, but I wouldn't be able to put a pinpoint on 450 people missing. Even if I was to, I live in a suburb of Toronto. So let's say that I was to go to like my family's hometown in Port Antonio, Jamaica, where we know a heck of a lot more people. Okay. If 450 people were to go missing from Port Antonio, Jamaica, where everybody knows everybody, I still wouldn't be able to put an accurate number on it. I would just know that there's a lot of people missing. So what they've done is just ask random people, how many people do you think are missing? And then extrapolate from that. Well, that means X percentage of the population based on there being 3,000 or 4,000 or 5,000 people are missing from this village. So if we extrapolate that number, we can predict that X amount of people are missing from this particular village. And given that these villages form X percentage of the total population of this prefecture, that's how many people are missing from this prefecture. So it's not even a castle of sand. It's, imagine a pyramid turned upside down, and that pyramid is made of sand, and it's being balanced on one grain. And the grain is the testimony of 8 people that would have no fucking clue how many people are missing from their village.
Yeah, it's 8 people from 8 separate villages in a district around Kashgar. And the second main primary source is our good friend Adrian Zenz, who is employed by the Victim of Communism, a very reputable organization. and if you look at his claim his claim depends primarily on this supposedly leaked report by this Uyghur exile group in Turkey, who, by the way, is known to support the Turkestan Islamic Party in Syria, which was an Al-Qaeda affiliate. But that's another story. So this Turkish Uyghur exile organization supposedly leaked a report. Based on the report, Adrian Zenz extrapolated that there could be 600 to 800,000 people in detention. And from that, he said, well, it's not unreasonable to extrapolate. He said this in his report. He said it's not unreasonable to extrapolate that there might be up to 1 million Uyghur in the concentration camp. And later that gets blown up to like 1.5 million and 3 million. And then we have people like who's that guy working for Middle East Eye? I'm doing a blank for a second. There are people claiming there are upwards of 6 million Uyghurs in concentration camp. Some of the even crazier claims say, oh, what's happening in Xinjiang is worse than, far exceeded the numbers of Jewish victims in the Holocaust. I'm like, this is gross. This is really gross, because I know my friend's grandma was a Holocaust survivor. I talked to her. I seen the tattoos on her arm, and I heard her stories. I mean, this is effectively another form of Holocaust denial to say, what happened in Xinjiang is worse than Holocaust. Holocaust is well established with mountains of evidence. Whereas in Xinjiang, as we talk about all these circumstantial innuendos of people with questionable background, by people like Adrian Zenz. Adrian Zenz, he wasn't very happy that the Gray Zone just did another debunking article on him. And another American scholar on Syria, Joshua Landis, recently just retweeted the Gray Zone article, and Adrian Zenz threatened to sue Joshua Landis for calling him a right-wing ideologue. I mean, the guy wrote a book called the guy literally wrote a book called Beyond Rapture, right? I mean, and he called for spiritual spanking of children. I mean, I don't know how, see how he can say it's a libel to call him a right-wing ideologue.
I mean, he just sounds like a modern-day Heinrich Harrier.
Could I add something?
No.
I think a lot of why people believe these things is because people don't want to believe that especially in the US, people don't want to believe that the US government is capable of knowingly spreading misinformation in order to further its own geopolitical goals. I mean, people tend to think, invading Iraq was a mistake, but it was well-intentioned because we genuinely believed that Saddam Hussein had WMDs, even though the US government didn't actually believe that, though at the top level, the top brass didn't. I'm sure there are some people in it who did because, so this is why I would highly recommend to people who are kind of new to their political development and are starting to question things. I highly recommend this book by William Blum. It is called Rogue State, A Guide to the World's Only Superpower. And in it, there is one particular chapter called Trojan Horse, the National Endowment for Democracy. And the NED is very active in these misinformation campaigns. And in fact, it did admit that starting at the turn of the century, it's been active in the Xinjiang region. And another book by, that's like the abridged version of this book, Killing Hope by William Blum. I'm not going to get too much into it because, yeah, same thing. But another book I recommend would be To Kill a Nation by Michael Parenti, which is about how basically what was left of Yugoslavia was eviscerated by the U.S. imperialists militarily after, political and economic subjugation that went on over the 90s. So yeah, I just wanted to because we're seeing what we're seeing in Xinjiang today is an attempted repeat at this, which Yugoslavia is a country of many nationalities, right? And for many decades they got along because if you're not in competition for resources and you're like and you're not like if you're all working together for a common goal and you're not in competition with each other for resources, then there's little reason for there to be ethnic strife, regardless of how bad history may have been. So, and that's also the same case in China with, China has 56 nationalities and 55 of them minority, one of them Han. And what they're trying to do now is paint Han as like the equivalent of like white supremacists in the US. Now, what they're trying to do is they're trying to increase tensions between the different nationalities, because of course, with different nationalities, a country as diverse as China, there's going to be some misunderstandings here and there. But the question is, what does the government do about these things? Does it attempt to resolve these contradictions, or does it attempt to make them worse or sweep them under the rug? We kind of see the US just kind of sweep a lot of these things under the rug. So I think that's why a lot of people believe that China would do something that's similar. But in fact, China has no incentive to carry out genocide or to disrespect the Uyghur culture, when in fact it is a very important geopolitical region, and what China wants most at this point is social harmony and a decrease in like ethnic tensions and social unrest.
I also like to point out there's a lot of projection. I think it's no coincidence they pick out the Xinjiang cotton story because they understand United States, there's a long association of slavery and cotton picking. And that will play on people's psyche. And there's, again, it's projection, right? And whatever U.S. claim that China is doing, U.S. is already doing it. We have concentration camps along our borders. We have children locked up in our cages. So people in U.S. are willing to believe, okay, if U.S. did this, okay, then maybe, China is doing the same thing. There's a other argument of people who trying to say, oh, well, just because U.S. is bad doesn't mean China is not bad. Also, right? Like there's an argument, and neither Beijing nor Washington, they're both bad, right?
But actually, Washington.
Yeah, I mean, but those both bad people usually say very little about the U.S. atrocities, but they're focused on the supposedly the allegation of the Chinese atrocities.
Not just U.S. atrocities, but like if you look at the last 20 years, like who has been the biggest killer of Muslims in the world? It's the U.S.
Okay. I need to drill down on this, and Andre, you're going to pull me up on my language here. But this is the thing, is that when there's blowback from Al Qaeda and the extremism that's been fostered by the U.S. itself, what has been the response by the U.S. is unparalleled carnage, illegal wars, and unparalleled carnage. So it's incredibly crazy to me that as soon as you propose de-radicalization, as soon as you propose any form of, hey, let's take these people that their community is suffering from a condition of hopelessness and they only feel like their outlet is religious extremism, some form of religious extremism. How do we take these people and give them another kind of hope? The U.S. paints it as this ominous thing of like, oh, the totalitarian state, they're, brainwashing people. Well, their response, the U.S.'s response to any form of blowback from their own fostering of extremism in the Middle East has been bloodshed from end to end, 500,000 dead Iraqis. That's been their response. So it's incredibly hypocritical to my mind.
That's projection again, though, right? Because in the U.S. and Canada, we use those false claims of terrorism in order to push a political agenda, right? So that China must be doing that too. If they couldn't possibly be terrorists, they couldn't possibly be U.S. funded, right? They're just using that as a scapegoat, right?
I mean, yeah. And if you look at, let's say, the invasion of Iraq, it's not just the number of people that are dead, the people that are wounded, Iraqis, and internally or externally displaced was like 25% of the population. And I remember one scholar, I forgot who, it was an Iraqi scholar, said the U.S. coming into Baghdad was about as destructive as the Mongols in the 12th, whichever century that came into Baghdad as well. I mean, you look at Afghanistan, basically, there's millions of refugees. I mean, even the European refugee crisis, where did the conflict come from? It was Western interventions into Syria and Libya. All of these things.
We can also look at the, so-called de-radicalization efforts in the Western countries. What do? We know all the Western intelligence agencies are well aware and monitor all these extremist groups in their own soil. What they willingly allow them to travel to Iraq and Syria to join ISIS. Right, and now even now we have in northeast Syria we have a camp. We have the camp Al Hol, which hold up 60,000 people of the ISIS families, mostly women and children, right, from the ISIS families, and many of them are originally from the West, and these Western governments in Europe and in U.S. are refusing to take them back in, instead just letting these people rotting in the camp, where now they're being ravaged by COVID. So this is not being talked about on mainstream media. This is essentially the de-radicalization effort of U.S. They just let these radicalized people travel to Syria and Iraq, go fight for ISIS, and then just let them just make it the problem for Iraqi people and the Syrian people. And this is how we deal with our problems here. And I mean, I can't speak so much about the Chinese effort, but at least it's not I mean, West is the last what the Western government are the last ones to say anything about this, because their ways of dealing with has been entirely disastrous.
Oh yeah, it was disastrous for basically the countries in the Middle East, and it's created floods of refugee crisis, that Europe has to deal with, and it's basically even it's in a way it's warped American and Western European politics. At the end of the day, the militarism, basically all of these things, and it all comes back to basically, that militarism.
And there's also like a dimension of domestic politics in U.S. that comes into play, right? I mean, why did Pompeo designate Xinjiang genocide right before he left office? It's because he's preparing for his own run in 2024, and this is his political legacy. And he's also leaving behind a poison pill in the U.S.-China relationship. So the next incoming administration it'll be increasingly difficult to reverse what the Trump administration has done in terms of the damage it done to the U.S.-China relationship. And I mean, this is why, the State Department now is trying to backpedal from the claim of genocide. They have the lawyers claim, there might be human rights abuse happening, but there's not enough evidence of genocide. I mean, this is why we're seeing that happening right now. I mean, a lot of the U.S. blaming on China is less about China or what China is doing. It's really about U.S. It's really about the votes and the U.S. election cycle, and it has nothing to do with China. But people don't realize this, amazingly.
I also think that this notion of, this is why I haven't promulgated these stories of like, oh, the State Department looked at it and they didn't find, that it would fit the mold of the technical definition, because I think that plays an ideological purpose as well. I think that's a very specific ideological purpose that suits the Biden administration to say, oh, well, we looked at it and it didn't measure up to the technical definition, but, shucks, they got away with it. They didn't meet the technical definition. Whereas if you look at, I think that it's a much more stronger frame from the United Nations Human Rights Council in 2019, where they say nothing that the U.S. is claiming is anything related to what we saw on the ground. We went there, we had people who went to the ground, and it does not resemble what the U.S. is claiming in any way, shape, or form. And so you have these two binaries of like what the Biden administration wants to say of like, oh, shucks, it just narrowly missed that technical definition of genocide. And the UN Human Rights Council, there was like, this does not look like what the U.S. is claiming at all.
But they took care of that. The mainstream media already took care of that narrative, because they say, oh, why are majority Muslim countries are not condemning China over this? Oh, it's because they are held hostage. They're indebted to China for the Chinese loans, or on hook in China with the Chinese money, so they can't say anything. And then that's how they explain why the global South is siding with China on this. This is because they're beholden to the Chinese money, unlike us. We, the conscientious defenders of human rights in the West. If you look at the map of the people who condemning China versus the people who took China's side, it's literally NATO countries plus U.S. client states like Japan and countries like that. But that's how they explain it. In their mind, international community is a Western alliance.
I mean, who else to jump into that? Andre, I know that you got some comments on this, the distinction between, those poor countries, they're beholden to China, but not the countries who vote with the U.S. Oh no, they're all. Oh
no, absolutely not. No. If you vote with China, then you are therefore beholden to China. You are in debt traps with China. You are enslaved to Chinese interests. But if you vote with the United States, a country which has engaged in debt traps, which does strong arm its partners into voting along with its interests at the UN. If you are voting alongside the United States and these Western imperial powers, no, absolutely not. Your intentions are pure. It's only when, and there's an element of racism to this. Like, I'm just like, no one said it so far, but I'm just going to go ahead and say it. that there's always been this yellow peril narrative that whatever it is that China or Japan or whichever power in the East it is that the United States happens to fear most of the time, whenever they engage in the simple practice of international trade and development of their own people and economies, that there is something sinister to it. And this is not me defending labor practices. This is not me defending trade practices, et cetera. Like China does, China does engage in trade with Israel and the Philippines, et cetera, which I do not agree with. Like, China is, I don't believe that China is a strictly socialist country. And I'm not going to sit here and critique any of that. It's just that I don't have a particular love for the practices of the Chinese government. But I can also sit here and understand there's a way to separate criticism of the Chinese state and its government policies from what it is that people are critiquing China for. And you never see them critique China for engaging in practices that harm the global South. That's never what the issue is. The issue is always that China is trying to become an imperial power, that it's trying to enslave Africa, that it's trying to take over the South China Sea, that it's trying to spread its influence, that it's attempting to enact the mandate of heaven. There's always some sort of Confucianist babble that you see like Western observers and China watchers come up with. There's always just this really weird stuff that if you knew nothing about China or Chinese history whatsoever, I think might be a little bit attractive or tempting to buy into. But if you've read just like a couple of books on history, and if you have any political principles whatsoever, it would strike you as absolute nonsense. So I didn't really have a lot to say about that, people who talk about that vote, other than, again, like it just behooves me not to be a credulous fool. And unfortunately, we're surrounded by them.
Yeah, I mean,
Xiangyu, Yiming.
That.
Yo, what's up?
That's perfect summary of basically, I think, the problem with a lot of the Chinese discourse, and you kind of do see it, like especially in Canada. I once had talking to a friend in the NDP, and I said, look, I think there's a legitimate interest that China has in its pursuit of its interest in international politics. And not everything that they do is nefarious. And, this is from a Canadian standpoint, right? Like, look, they're going to pursue their interests, and we got to figure out what are the things that we're willing to accommodate and what are the things we're not. And then right behind my back, he told one of my other friends that I was a Chinese apologist just for saying this. And it's like, all right, if you then what do you expect? Like, you want a dialogue about these things. And then right at the back, you call someone a Chinese apologist that says, all right, like, look, we should have like framework for basically how we discuss these issues. It's like they don't even want to have a dialogue.
Basically, anyone who criticizes the Western position, is a Chinese apologist. Especially if you are a person of Chinese heritage, then you're definitely a shell
or like a tanky. And it's like, sometimes I have people like, one of my buddies just said like tanky, and to me, I just got enough. It's like, it's not an insult to me, right? Like, I don't care if you call me a tanky or not. Like, call me whatever. Like,
it's funny though how they use the word tanky, because if you know the origins of the term, it's about how Khrushchev sent in tanks to crush the Hungarian counter-revolution.
Hungarian Revolution, yeah.
And who are being crushed by the tanks? The opposition that's being lauded as like pro-democratic, anti-Stalinist, even though Stalin was already dead. It was a color revolution complete with pogroms.
Yeah.
And you're calling us tankies, and calling us genocide apologists or accusing us of like genocide denial. Like, what the
absolutely,
fuck?
But there are two issues going on here. One is it's not an insult. It's not actually an insult because you can legitimately say in 1956 there was anti-Semitic pogroms going on, and that's not legitimate. And so the insult of tanky, not really an insult. But then there's the entirely
it's a stupid term, though.
It's a stupid term. But then there's the entirely separate issue of like contemporary domestic politics of anyone, not of Marxist-Leninist or non-Marxist-Leninist politics, who says, hey, maybe we shouldn't go along with this crazy level of xenophobic propaganda and hatred of China and hatred of Chinese people. And as soon as you say that, then you're an apologist for the CPC. Oh, you're an apologist for the Chinese Communist Party, and you know,
like Nathan Rooser and friends, the way they think.
Yeah, and it's crazy to me. I would like to talk about and deconstruct in the Five Eyes nations, in the UK, in Australia, in Canada, in New Zealand, in the US, there are definite material interests. There are weapons companies who pay money to gin up hatred of contemporary China. They want these societies to be mouth frothily hating of contemporary China. And that's what today's vote with Erin O'Toole in the Canadian House of Parliament, that's what voting for Erin O'Toole's motion was today.
Here's what I have to say about a lot of this saber rattling, though, is you know, I don't really care if you are pro or anti-China, but the thing is, if you want to be anti-China, that's fine. But if you keep on resorting to lies and slander to defend your views, then I don't know, you're just kind of something tells me that you're not to be trusted. And this goes towards China supporters too. If a China supporter were to constantly back up his arguments with a bunch of lies, wouldn't you find that person untrustworthy? Yeah, that's kind of, and you find this, this happens a lot with, oh, sorry.
No, please finish.
Oh, and this always seems to happen with countries that, you know, the U.S. for one reason or another wants to target. For example, like Cuba or the DPRK, more so the DPRK, because they're easier to vilify just because people are less familiar with Korean culture and history. It's you know, you keep on having, okay, I believe that there are legitimate reasons that why certain people might want to defect, but then when these celebrity defectors keep on like Park Yeon-mi keep on coming up with stories that are easily debunked time and time again, yet keep on being propagated by the propaganda machine of the imperialists, then
Park Yeon-mi, if you are listening to this, please, I extend my invitation to come to my podcast so you can steal.
Park Yeon-mi 동무야, 환영합니다. Okay, I'm done.
If you want, I could get back to your original point about like the defense industry.
Well, no. Kayla had a point, but I want to hear both of you guys' points. So I don't know who.
Comment really briefly on this point about, you know, dismissing any, even asking questions as being a tanky or, you know, constantly moving the goalposts of the conversation when you know, can debunk one claim, then another one pops up that's completely unrelated. It's that, you know, the groundwork has been laid for decades for people to accept this belief, right? Or to accept any claim that's made. And so this is how disinformation functions, is that these claims don't need to be true. They don't even need to be believable, but they need to act as evidence to something that you already know, right? So we already know China is a bad country. We know China is authoritarian, repressive, all these things, because we've seen it in the media for the last 10 years. You throw in Adrian Zenz and these claims, and they don't even need to be credible, believable, anything like that. They can be easily debunked, but you can't debunk them. And, you know, seeing what's unfolded on Andre's Twitter, which I really enjoyed watching, and I feel for you, you know, what you went through this week, is that these people cannot be convinced, right? It's very similar to, it's the same people who will look at Trump supporters and say, look at these idiots who support QAnon and fake news and all this bullshit. Well, they're doing the exact same thing, right? But with China, and it's more acceptable to do so, right? And so in this like new liberal discourse, anything bad or anything that we don't like or question is imperialism, it's genocide, it's Han supremacy, it's forced labor, right? And so the far right has learned the language of the left and is weaponizing it against ourselves, right? And so I think for me, that's like incredibly dangerous and insidious on their side. Yeah, that's where I'm going with this.
Yeah, I mean, people in the U.S. and most of the West, they always claim that Chinese people are brainwashed and they're just government bots. But they don't realize the amount of propaganda we've been bombarded with in the West on a daily basis for decades. I mean, in China or in the former Soviet Union, people know the government media is espousing the government line. I mean, people understand that. The people know how to interpret.
You take it with a big grain of salt. But here it's like every little thing in the New York Times, that must be true. And it's like, it's not just China, it's also Russia too. And it's like, look, I'm not, domestic politics wise, right? Like Putin, there are, some things that he's done, like the cutting back the Social Security. and whatnot. But it's like, if you look at from an international politics standpoint, it's like, you know, the demonization is just really idiotic.
I mean, it's a totally separate thing. It's a totally separate. But look at Putin. Putin is an autoimmune response to American intervention in Russia. Yeah, he's a horrible authoritarian guy. Blah blah blah. But he was a response. It's Russians trying to feel some sense of pride and you know, redemption from having been messed around and meddled with for 20 years.
I mean, you know, like, people talk about the 2016 election meddling by Russia. And it's like, if you actually look at what it's done compared to the 1996 elections, when the Americans sent all the consultants into Moscow to get Yeltsin a win, I mean, it's like a drop in the bucket. And it's
and they don't mention that, you know, Putin was Yeltsin's chosen successor. It was Yeltsin, the ultimate American puppet, who chose Putin to be his successor. They don't talk about that.
Well, you know, like, Yeltsin realized he needed someone that could, you know, protect him and give him like immunity. So he picked Putin. But it's like, you look at Putin in the start of his term, if you actually look at a lot of his speeches and orientations, like, he's actually quite pro-Western. And a lot of the deteriorations that you saw, I think, with the Russia, the Russia and the, you know, the Russia and the Western relations, it's mostly in the West. And, you know, if you actually read people on, like, George Kennan, the guy that wrote the Long Telegram, and he's not, like, he's a pretty sexist and racist person. But even he was saying, like, you know, with the NATO expansions and American policies, and this was like in 2004, a few years before he died, he's like, this is going to like really poison U.S.-Russia relations. And I mean, I know I'm jumping like way off target here, and, you know, like, and everybody just ignored him. And I guess to also come back to the point of like what I was originally going to say is that I do think, yeah, you're right, Doug, that basically that the defense industry, especially in the U.S., has like a very, very large role in the propagation of basically these narratives about China. And I suspect, you know, I'm looking into these things, my own research, I suspect one of the reasons why you had a shift from terrorism to China is because terrorism is no longer a strong enough of a justification to basically fund F-25s, like super advanced fighters and massive aircraft carriers. I mean, you know,
I just want to pick up on that because I came to United States in 1990, and at that time, I was hungry for news on my homeland, so I will always go search the page of New York Times looking for any bits of news in China. What I noticed even back then, there was an attempt to build up China as the next boogeyman, because 1991, that's when Soviet Union collapsed. Right, and suddenly people are questioning why we're spending insane amount of money into the defense industry. At the time, that's when the first time that the so-called China threat theory started emerging. But back in 1990s, it looked so ridiculous because back then Chinese economy was still relatively undeveloped. I mean, it wasn't really able to fill the shoes of former Soviet Union. But for a long time, there have been a two side of the story in United States. One side is a China containment side proposed by the national security sector, you know, the Pentagon and all the defense intelligence complex people. But on the other side, there's the China engagement lobby, which is by the big businesses, because they're hungry to go into exploit the Chinese market, to exploit the Chinese labor. So for a while there was a balance between the two sides. But I think what we have seen in the last 10 years, especially starting from the early Obama years, starting from the Obama years, what happened is U.S. started to notice the China's economic rise, and they felt threatened. And even among U.S. businesses who formerly seen China as like land of opportunity, you know, just cheap pool of cheap labor and also a potential market. And now they've seen these Chinese companies as potential competitors, right? So now there's a confluence of factors in U.S. that make now like China became a bipartisan issue in the United States. All the elites are aligned, agree. Okay, we got to do something about China, right? And a lot of the problems in U.S. gets to blame on China as well. I mean, like look like right now we still have a former Trump deputy national security advisor Matt Pottinger. He just recently he's going around and still trying to pin the COVID story on China. He's still peddling the conspiracy theory that COVID was leaked out of a Chinese lab.
Boy, that WHO report really put a dent in the U.S.'s wagon, didn't it?
Well, you remember that tweet by one of like the WHO like delegates, and then it's like the New York Times article, it's like, and then explicitly had to say like, this is not my experience. Like,
and here's the thing is that I was going to say is 2 points is exactly taking off of that tweet from that guy who the doctor who was on this. He said, I'm being mischaracterized by the New York Times. You go down the list, the New York Times, the BBC, the Guardian, CBC, all of these these legacy Western sources, they've disgraced themselves on China, on Russia, on Syria. It's literally like they're getting a sheet from the U.S. State Department to say, you will report this narrative. And then they're kind of like ham-fistedly shoehorning it in. So there's one point. If anyone wants to jump in on that point about the Western media having disgraced themselves, go for it. But I just want to mention additionally the whole field of the accusation, oh, China is capitalist. You know, oh, we don't need to care about China because they're capitalist.
Could I jump in on that point, though?
Sure, go ahead.
So, you know, like the 2007-2008 response, right? Like it was catastrophic in the U.S. in terms of number of jobs lost. So it was about 14 million. I think by 2009, the U.S. lost those jobs. China initially, because of the crisis, was lost about 30 million factory jobs. But by 2009, the net job loss was about 3 to 4 million. And you're talking about a country that is 4 times the size of the United States in terms of population. And, you know, recently they've gotten rid of absolute poverty, right? In China, those poverty and the anti-poverty programs. So yes, they take like major aspects of, you know, capitalism and market mechanisms, whatnot, without a doubt. But, you know, for me, you know, I still see it as a country, you know, it's not a communist country, don't get me wrong, but it's a socialist economy in a sense that it's moving towards providing some form of public good with the incredibly limited amount of resources they have. They have per capita 1/3 of the per capita as the US. And it is insane that a kid born in China today versus a kid born in the US today would have the same amount of healthy life expectancy, not total life expectancy, healthy, like you're not, you know, you're not bound in a wheelchair and whatnot, like, you know, good quality life. They have the same number of years if you're born in China compared to if you're born in the USA. And the USA is a country that is 3 times as rich as the China's per capita wise. So
I want to respond to that, you know, how China turned capitalist, all that. I mean, as a person who was born and grew up in China, you know, I was born in China in 1976, a month after Mao passed away. So I came to the United States in 1990. So the entire decade of 1980s I spent in China, and I have been going back and visit. All I know is throughout my life in China is getting better and better. Yeah. I mean, this is just without a doubt, you know, like that's just across the board, not just like the top 1%. This is across the board, the entire Chinese population, because I came from, I don't know, like I come from my dad was a college lecturer. My mom was a nurse. So we're kind of middle of the road, but my uncles, they work in factories, right? And so based on my experience and my friends, my family in China, life just been getting better and better on a yearly basis. Mm-hmm. I think, you know, we can talk about, you know, ideological purity, but at the end of the day, you know, what you need to do is provide people with a better life. And I think
I want to jump in here because I appreciate that, but what I was trying to get at is like, you know, I don't think we should valorize laissez-faire because that's not what's going on in China today. The point that I was trying to get at is like, you know, people say, oh, China is capitalist as a reason to say, oh, we shouldn't care. They're just a capitalist authoritative, blah, 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 blah. But then you wouldn't have, if that were true, you wouldn't have the Brookings Institute putting out monthly reports saying China is providing us insufficient market access for these specific commodities. And that's the issue, is that what China is doing does have market mechanisms. So there is capitalist elements, but it's nonetheless different from and state-led and under the rubric of a very organized form of production that the U.S. objects to. And so,
I want to point out sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, like, the 4 largest banks in the world, they're all Chinese state-owned banks, and they finance these, you know, very, very large infrastructural projects that we've seen, whether it's through like housing, like the ghost cities that people say, oh, look at all these ghost cities the Chinese building. What are they thinking?
And then they get full.
And then basically high-speed rail, which now the Cato Institute a few days ago saying like...
That was hilarious.
Yeah.
That was like, effing hilarious. That was genuinely like laugh out loud, belly hurt hilarious. When
it's
the
like
Cato
these guys
Institute...
never drove in China. Like, I you know, like... When I went back to visit my relatives and they drove around Beijing, it's insane. Like, and you're going to tell me you're going to drive from Beijing to Shanghai?
Hold on. For anyone who doesn't know, for anyone who watches this and doesn't know what we're talking about, is a few days ago, the Cato Institute put out a tweet that was like, high-speed, you know, China's building high-speed rail. High-speed rail, it's not as efficient as flying. And it's, you know, it's more expensive than driving or some shit like that. It was just like demonizing high-speed rail. And why are they doing that? Because they won't, in the US, they're so committed to laissez-faire capitalism that they won't spend the state-led money to update their decrepit, decaying public infrastructure. And so they have to demonize anyone else who's doing it. Like
in US, it's not even laissez-faire capitalism. It's oligarchy because in LA, you have the Ford, you have all the big auto manufacturing paying the city to rip out all the real infrastructure before and to build highways. LA was a city. Yeah, LA was a city planned for automobiles. I mean, the real difference between China and US is in US we have all our government, our politicians funded by the big corporations. You know, if you're a rich guy, you know, like Jeff Bezos, you own the Washington Post, you dictate policy, you fund think tanks, right? Like in China, Jack Ma doesn't dictate policy. You know, Chinese government tell Jack Ma what he can or cannot do. That is a big difference. You know, the capitalists, they don't get to have a say how the government is run in China. They get a say, but the final say is still like, look, you know, the party has to balance like various interests, right? Like, you know, this is what the Ant Group, like they're saying, it's not that like we're not letting you do this. It's like, look, this is just a huge amount of risk. You're going to put like average investors at risk, and your business model is going to cause a lot of social suffering because, you know, all the lending, right? So like you got to like go back to the drawing board with the Ant Group and then, you know, give us like, you're not a technology company, you're a financial company, right? Whereas the US, they'd be like, yeah, do it. Like, you know, let's fund it just like with Uber. And with Uber, I think today it's like, they're still not making money. Like what they're banking on is like the self-driving cars. And it's like, well, we could fire all our drivers and that's how we're going to make money. So please give us more money. Yeah, if China is the same as U.S., Jack Ma would own People's Daily. You know, he will be putting out all these articles we read about how Ant Group is a good thing, and then he will have all the think tanks to put out the articles, you know, supporting his view, and then all the, you know, the Chinese delegate in the National People's Congress will vote will vote with his sponsorship, and that's what we have in U.S. today. But that's not happening in China.
And in Canada too. Like I want to pick up on that thread that Doc brought up earlier too about, you know, the media and their role in this. And like I did a study that I hope to publish soon about negative stories about China running Canada. So I mean, Pew Research Institute recently published a story where they said there's 67% negative opinion by Canadians on China. And that went up from 27% in 2005. So you see a huge jump in negative opinion by Canadians on China. Well, I wanted to see, well, what's the Globe and Mail saying over that period? So between 2005 and 2019, through my sampling, I found that there's a 300% increase in negative stories on China during that period, right? So this is like a concerted effort in order to demonize the Chinese state. And I mean, you can see this, it doesn't have to be necessarily about China, but particularly like anti-communism and anti-leftist politics as well. You can see like in culture, for example, like I recently watched the Chernobyl series, for example, and like they have this caricature of the socialist Soviet government as this like awful authoritarian evil state. And I don't want to get into the politics of the Soviet Union at all, but like you can just see how things are caricaturized so easily. And as socialist ideas are becoming more popular in Canada, this is a tool that you can use to shut down leftists, right? And this whole, Uyghur thing is part of that as well, right? Well, how could you be a socialist? Look at those Chinese, look what they're doing to the Uyghurs, right? So this is like a concerted effort in order to quash leftist politics at home as well.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, to build on that, it's like I try to caution a lot of people about the sinophobia and like going in rah all this stuff, because at the end of the day, what you're ultimately doing is basically you are limiting the politics of the left, and you're basically going to divert that attention that should instead be used to focus on our own domestic politics, which right now, like even in Canada, is quite a goddamn mess. Like I am in Toronto, and I'm sure like Adrian, you could attest, like, the response by the Ford government to our premier is basically catastrophic. I mean, it's not as bad as the US, but it's pretty terrible. The cutting back the minimum, the $15 minimum wage, getting rid of the sick days. This is all a distraction from that, and also our federal politics, and in Canada, but also especially in the U.S., of what they really need to do, because they have a really broken system. Like when you look, let's take a look, going back, like talking about, like China, right? The Chinese system has adapted basically more than twice to three times from the time span of after Mao's death, right? You had the market reforms. That's one thing. And then the entry into the WTO, that's basically another sort of major reforms. And then you had basically with Xi Jinping's rise, you had the anti-corruption crackdowns. You could say that those are three major reforms within the Chinese system. You look at the same period in the US, nothing's really changed that much. Like even with Obama.
That total inability to adapt, I think, is really what characterizes the US over the past 20 years. They've been spinning their tires, trying the exact same thing over and over again.
Yeah, I mean, like, exactly, Doc. Like, look at Obama. I mean, he was brought in a moment that required a lot of major radical change and just underperformed, like, greatly. I mean, yes, there's a lot of factors that, that we have to discuss about this, but at the end of the day, if we're talking about the overall American system, it hasn't changed to the degree that people see
that's by design, though. I mean, the lack of change in U.S. we've seen is by design. I mean, look what happened when even Bernie trying to change something, he was shut down immediately by the establishment. I mean, this is like what Bernie proposed is not even something radical. It's just like making U.S. more like say Scandinavian countries.
Well, what Bernie proposes is saying let's go back to America of the 1930s and 40s, the New Deal, right? We're going to bring in social protections. We're going to basically shield people from the worst aspects of market uncertainty. And after he said that, Bill Gates is like, look, if the Democrats pick Bernie Sanders, I can't support him, all that stuff. And you had the Washington Post saying like, oh, this is like socialism and like.
But that's one way. That's one way of positioning it. That's one way of saying that Bernie is a Keynesianism. He wants to go back to the 1930s. I think it's more interesting to look on the international scene, the foreign policy, and say, yeah, he was an imperialist. He conceded to a whole bunch of BS as it pertains to other nations, but he wanted a kind of reset. Yeah, Keynesianism, yeah, 1930s, but let's position the U.S. as a crashing plane. And Bernie very tepidly, very mildly said, "Hey, let's pull up." And they were like, "No, F you, shut up, old man."
And you're absolutely right. And that's one of the things that's very scary about American politics right now, because if you cannot adjust to those even mild concessions, like you're pretty much asking for like a more coercive form, like even, like the Capitol riots, compared to like things that could happen, the child's play. So
Sorry, I wanted to go back to an earlier point Kayla made about kind of the propaganda and brainwashing we've been subjected to in the West. Do you guys remember the Red Dawn remake? So originally,
it was originally was that supposed to be Chinese people?
Chinese.
Yes. So originally, the Red Dawn remake was supposed to be China taking over U.S. And then after 2008, after the Warner re-emerged from bankruptcy, they realized, if they're going to make it about Chinese, they might not be able to sell the movie rights in China. So they went back and digitally remastered everything to make it about North Korea, which is totally ridiculous. Any thinking person will realize how stupid that sounds about North Korean invasion of United States. But then, some people actually blame that, saying, you see the Chinese influence in U.S. extended to Hollywood. Now they're forcing us to not making anti-China propaganda. We have to change target to North Korea. So that was listed as an example of how China is forcing change upon United States. Another one is, so there's a lot of projection. We blame all our faults on China. Like another thing is they try to blame the Hollywood racism on China as well. It's like, it's because the Chinese audience don't like black people, so that's why we're not casting black actors. Black Panthers did well in China.
Not just well. It was the highest grossing Marvel film up to that point, right?
But that has still been a lot of talk points among many people in U.S. And China is racist. That's why we cannot cast more black actors.
Yeah, they were using that excuse for Star Wars, like the last Star Wars movie. It's like, it's because China doesn't like the diversity. And for me, it's like, well, have you ever thought about maybe the new Star Wars sequels? They're just shit. Like they're not that good actually.
You guys are going off on American movies. And, everybody talks about the Wolf Warrior diplomacy. I'm one of the ones who love the Wolf Warrior series. Wolf Warrior 2. Wolf Warrior.
What is Rambo?
The solidarity and love between the African workers and the Chinese Wolf Warrior soldiers. That was heartwarming, people haven't picked up on this yet. The Wolf Warrior series is actually one of the greatest action film series of all time.
I like Wolf Warrior just because it's a fun movie. I mean, like all these people who criticize Wolf Warrior, I'm like, you guys probably enjoy Rambo, and it's basically Rambo with Chinese characteristic. I mean, but I do have there's some valid criticism of people who are saying Wolf Warrior just using Africa as a backdrop to tell a Chinese story. There's valid criticism for that. They could have integrated more African characters to give them more central.
I mean, the movie was pretty fucking racist. Like, let's not try to skirt around it. It was a pretty fucking racist movie. Yeah.
But as just a fun movie, it's fun. I mean, I enjoy Rambo too. I mean, shit. I know what Rambo movie is trying to do. The political message is shit. But it's a fun movie. I enjoy Wolf Warrior at the same level.
It's like your standard action flick, right?
Yeah.
And if you read too much politics into that stuff, it's not going to work, or you get really terrible politics. Yeah. And it's it's just that the projection or the constant politicization of all aspects of China. It's just, and I think that becomes problematic, and we actually miss out on maybe a lot of the things that, I would even say for our own domestic politics that maybe China did right. right? Like it would actually be incredibly helpful if we actually had a major infrastructure spending bill right now in Canada and the US. Like if they started building a high-speed rail between Montreal and Hamilton.
They won't.
I also like to go back to the Wolf Warrior some of the issue with the movie. I mean, like I agree with Andre. There's definitely elements of racism in that movie. But it's undeniable. I mean, racism exists in many societies, including China. We should not ignore that. But there is a slight difference in case of China, because a lot of racism derives from ignorance in China rather than maliciousness. And I think, and that's why I think the Chinese CCTV Spring Festival Gala was rightfully called out for having blackface for having blackface performances. That was uncalled for. They could easily have some African actors performing the show. I mean, but again, that's stemmed from ignorance. The skit that people called them out for. It was more about China-African unity, but it was done in such a stupid, clumsy way, rather than people donning blackface to mock the African people. I think that there's a difference about that. That's what I gotta say.
Somebody's dog is going off. Okay, well, this has been a good discussion. It's about an hour now. Andre, do you think that you could provide some last words for this second episode of the LMBD on the topic of China? Your last week, what we've discussed tonight, the points that we've been made, our ending sermon.
No, my last words is, when you're being caught into the tailwind of an imperialist narrative, always question your sources. Like, this is not hard. Again, I am a freelance writer. I know that my title is contributing editor at Maclean's Magazine and all that, and I completely get that. But I don't have any more or higher access to information than anybody else does. I've had a few generous people send me resources. I've had some people translate some of the resources that I've come across. But for the most part, this is me doing self-directed study, and not even into the claims that China is making, but into the claims that Western-backed NGOs and actors are making about China. And all I'm doing is simply investigating the claims that they've made for myself. And I've come to the conclusion that this is smoke and mirrors in an attempt to balkanize China. And it makes me really, I guess, like sad for people who claim that they have left politics and have sort of like principled socialist politics. It makes me really sad that we're so desperate for a win and so desperate to feel good about our politics that we're willing to go along with an imperialist narrative, which is very likely going to result in the collective punishment of possibly tens of millions of people, because we feel like we need to be on the right side of something. And if you have left principles, if you have integrity in both your political ideology and in yourself, then it behooves you. I'm not even saying you have to agree with me. You don't have to agree with me. You don't have to agree with anybody on this panel. But it does behoove you to look into these claims for yourself and come to what I think would be a rational conclusion. My rational conclusion is that there is the possibility of surveillance, of state overreach, possible human rights abuses. Like, I'm entirely open to those facts being the case. But what I am not open to is the idea that this is a genocide. I'm sorry. That's just absolutely farcical. And it just makes me upset that so many people are willing to close their eyes and be dragged along into this tailwind rather than exercise some basic scrutiny. That's all.
Those are great ending words. I'd like to thank everybody. I'd like to thank all the guests today. And yeah, that's a great episode. That's a great episode and great end. Last words stand on.
All right, Joe.